crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them.
America's first in-flight space disaster was triggered by a simple rubber gasket that had frozen overnight.
On January 28, 1986, the Challenger crew climbed into the shuttle, expecting a routine mission that millions of Americans were watching with pride. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle broke apart on live television. The search that followed took place deep in the Atlantic, far from cameras, and raised difficult questions about the crew's final moments.
NASA did recover many pieces of wreckage back in 1986, including
stainless steel fittings down here. This is really different.
This is the part of the story almost no one talks about.
You can use the science to cut through the bullshit to ensure that the real reason for those deaths gets out, that is made completely clear to the public. NASA's forced to admit it and has to reform.
The launch that changed everything. The Challenger launch was meant to be a defining moment for America because its crew wasn't just another group of astronauts. It was the most diverse and symbolically important team NASA had ever sent into space. Alongside veteran astronauts were a civilian school teacher, engineers from different specialties, a mission specialist of Japanese-American heritage, and researchers chosen to represent the expanding future of spaceflight. The commander was Francis Scobie, who had a long record of flying and many years of training. The pilot was Michael Smith, who was known for calm decision-making in stressful situations. Mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair were responsible for scientific tasks and technical operations that supported the mission's goals. Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis was prepared to conduct research that involved fluid behavior in space. Krista McAuliffe was the teacher chosen to represent a new educational program that aimed to inspire young people by allowing them to see someone from a familiar profession travel into space. These 7 individuals had trained together for months, and many people across the country felt a personal connection to them because the mission was presented as both scientific and educational. Crowds gathered at Kennedy Space Center with a deep sense of excitement because they believed they were witnessing a mission that would lift the country's spirits and encourage new interest in space exploration. People felt that this launch carried more meaning than a routine shuttle flight. Visitors filled the bleachers early in the morning, even though the air felt unusually cold for Florida. Across the United States, classrooms prepared to watch the event live because teachers hoped their students would feel inspired by the idea that ordinary people could participate in important missions. The space shuttle stood tall and still on the launch pad, and the clear blue sky made the scene look calm. The cold temperatures created concerns that were quietly discussed among some experts.
9, 8,
It was a bitter cold but sparkling clear morning at Cape Canaveral. Here, the last seconds of the countdown.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Yet the countdown moved forward because officials believed the shuttle systems were ready. Technicians and engineers who had spent countless hours preparing the spacecraft felt confident in the work they had done. No one watching expected any sign of danger. When the engines ignited and the Challenger lifted away from the pad, the crowd reacted with loud cheers that carried a sense of relief and excitement. People pointed upward with wide eyes because the shuttle appeared strong and bright as it climbed. Inside Mission Control, teams focused on the screens that displayed the shuttle's performance. Every reading appeared normal. The mission looked stable and predictable. For the first 73 seconds, everything followed the familiar pattern that NASA had practiced repeatedly. Viewers across the country felt proud because the launch seemed to be unfolding exactly as the nation hoped. Many people believed that the most challenging part was already behind the crew. Then, without warning, a burst of light tore through the sky, and the shuttle broke into 2 massive plumes of white smoke. The reaction was immediate shock. People on the ground stood frozen because their minds could not accept what their eyes were seeing. In Mission Control, the room fell completely silent because the event did not match anything they had prepared for in simulations. Teachers in classrooms clutched their desks. Students stared at the screen with disbelief. Families watching from home leaned closer to their televisions, waiting for the shuttle to appear again. For a few long moments, many people hoped that the cloud of smoke might reveal the orbiter continuing upward.
It happened just over 1 minute into flight.
1 minute. 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The broadcast became tense and confused because even the commentators were struggling to understand the situation. Mission Control finally spoke, and the words carried a heavy shock that spread instantly across the country. The statement said that there had been a major malfunction. Those words marked the beginning of a national tragedy that no one had imagined only moments before. Fear and heartbreak grew quickly as people realized that the crew they had just celebrated was now in grave danger. NASA shifted into emergency procedures with enormous urgency because the situation demanded an immediate response. Coast Guard and Navy teams received instructions to begin search and rescue operations in the Atlantic Ocean. Many people held on to a faint hope that someone from the crew might still be alive, even though that hope had little support in reality. Pieces of debris fell into the ocean, and ships headed toward the impact area as quickly as they could. What happened next was one of the largest search operations in American history. From rescue mission to grim recovery. Within minutes after the explosion, the waters east of Cape Canaveral became crowded with ships, cutters, helicopters, and aircraft that were sent to search for the crew. The team scanned the waves with intense concentration as they looked for anything that might signal life. They searched for an inflated raft, a survival beacon, or even a floating suit that might suggest someone had reached the surface. Crews moved through the ocean in organized grids, and each vessel followed a careful pattern to make sure no area was missed. The sea was covered by an enormous number of people and machines, yet the water remained completely silent. No one found any sign of survivors. As the hours continued, pieces of the orbiter appeared on the surface of the water. Some fragments were pieces of tile, others were bits of insulation, pieces of metal, or parts of the external tank. Each new discovery made it harder for anyone to hold on to hope. The teams in Mission Control received the early reports without speaking because the details were painful to process. Engineers understood that the forces created during the breakup at nearly 48,000 feet were so severe that survival was extremely unlikely. Even so, official procedures required the search to continue. The Coast Guard announced late in the afternoon that the mission would shift from rescue to recovery. That moment made it clear that the focus had changed because the situation no longer allowed hope for survivors. Night settled quietly over the Atlantic. The water moved gently, and the calmness of the sea felt heavy because it stood in contrast to the violence of the day. Searchlights swept across the surface and revealed pieces of debris that floated across the dark water. These fragments looked like parts of a mission that had once held enormous promise. Divers entered the water and attached markers to underwater fragments. They used dye and buoys to make sure the pieces could be found again. By this point, everyone understood that the operation would demand far more time than they had first imagined. It would not take hours. It would require weeks of continuous effort. In the days that followed, the debris field expanded far beyond the area that anyone expected. Aircraft flew over the region to create maps of the surface. Sonar vessels moved across the water and searched the seabed for anything that had sunk. Every branch of the military offered equipment and personnel to support the effort. The people involved soon realized that they were not only gathering broken parts of a spacecraft, they were gathering evidence that would eventually explain what had gone wrong. Despite the thousands of fragments that had already been found, the crew cabin was still missing. This unresolved issue drove the search teams to move into deeper and more challenging waters, mapping the ocean for answers. As recovery teams began to understand how large the debris field truly was, the search effort became much more organized and increasingly technical. NASA created the Search, Recovery, and Reconstruction Task Force to direct the mission and to make sure that every group involved worked toward the same goal. The Navy brought in sonar vessels that could scan wide stretches of the ocean floor. They also deployed submarines that could travel through dark waters where light could not reach. Dive teams with training for low visibility conditions prepared for long hours underwater. Every participant shared the same objective, which was to locate and map every significant object resting on the seabed. Although the Atlantic waters near Florida are shallower than those in the open ocean, they presented another challenge. Visibility underwater was extremely poor. Silt, sand, and shifting currents made it difficult to see more than a short distance. Divers moved carefully because they sometimes felt pieces of debris before they actually saw them. Sonar operators examined unclear shapes on their screens and learned to recognize the difference between natural features on the seabed and the remains of the shuttle. Every object that looked unusual required a closer look. Each confirmed discovery added another part to the expanding picture of what had happened. During the weeks that followed, the task force removed more than 100 tons of wreckage from the ocean. They lifted sections of the wing, parts of the fuselage, burned wiring, pipes, and fragments of the external tank. Every recovered piece was labeled and then transported to Kennedy Space Center. Inside the large hangar, workers placed the fragments on steel frameworks that recreated the general outline of the shuttle. Engineers walked through the growing arrangement of debris and studied it closely. They searched for signs of burning, patterns of breakage, and clues that might explain which parts had failed first. Even with all of this progress, the most important section remained missing. The crew cabin had not been found. Its absence created a growing sense of pressure. Investigators needed the cabin to understand the final seconds of the flight. Families hoped that recovering it would bring them answers they desperately needed. Recovery teams felt the weight of time because every day that passed without progress increased the urgency. Due to the violence of the disaster, the cabin could have remained intact. It could have been buried beneath layers of sand, or it might have broken into several large parts. Sonar operators continued their work around the clock, and every echo was examined with patience and care. A breakthrough finally arrived on March 7, 1986. The USS Preserver reported a sonar contact that appeared different from anything previously detected. The signal suggested the presence of a large object with an uneven shape. It was partly buried in the seabed and located 16 to 18 miles off the Florida coast. Its size matched what search leaders believed could be the forward section of the shuttle's fuselage. A dive team prepared to descend immediately in order to verify the discovery. What they found next would change the course of the entire investigation. The discovery of the crew cabin. The divers lowered themselves through the dim water with slow and steady movements as they held onto ropes and followed the small light bars attached to their equipment. The deeper they went, the darker the water became. As they approached the seabed, they noticed the faint outline of a large structure beginning to take shape beneath them. At first, it looked like nothing more than a broad shadow buried in the sand. When additional lights were moved into position, the shape became clearer. The divers finally recognized what they were seeing. It was the forward section of the shuttle's fuselage. It was the crew cabin. The atmosphere on the USS Preserver changed immediately. The discovery was not just another piece of debris. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, and it was also the moment everyone feared. The cabin was severely damaged and broken in several places, yet its overall form remained identifiable. Divers confirmed that some areas of the interior were still enclosed. This meant that the work ahead had to be carried out with extreme caution. Recovery specialists began attaching lifting cables to the fragments. They moved slowly and deliberately because they knew they were handling material that might contain the remains of the 7 astronauts. The crew on the ship cleared the deck to create space. Press access was stopped, and a protected area was set up around the site. When the first section of the cabin rose out of the water, the people on board fell silent. Even the ocean seemed to quiet itself during the process. Once the cabin pieces were brought onto the deck and secured, NASA officials, Navy officers, and pathologists completed an initial examination. They found enough of the structure intact to begin forming early understandings. The evidence showed that the crew cabin had separated from the rest of the shuttle, mostly intact at the moment of the explosion. After breaking away, it had traveled through the air in a long arc before striking the ocean at a speed greater than 200 miles per hour. The impact was so violent that survival would not have been possible. The recovery ship carried the cabin sections under military guard to Kennedy Space Center. The investigators there understood that they were about to face the most difficult stage of the mission. For the first time since the disaster, they would confront the physical evidence that revealed what had happened to the crew. As the cabin traveled toward the hangar, one question weighed heavily on everyone involved. They wondered what investigators would find inside, and what those discoveries would reveal about the crew's final seconds. The shocking revelation: what actually happened to the crew. Once the fragments of the crew cabin arrived at Kennedy Space Center, the investigation entered its most tightly controlled phase. The hangar where the work would take place was closed completely to the public. Only a select group of people were allowed inside. This included high-ranking NASA officials, military pathologists, and forensic specialists. Their task was painful, but necessary. Every action had to be handled with strict care and discretion because of the sensitivity of what they were about to confront. Inside the wreckage, investigators discovered what had long been feared. Human remains were present within the recovered cabin structure. The remains showed evidence of extreme trauma caused by 3 major events. First, the mid-air breakup of the shuttle had violently torn apart the structure. Then, rapid depressurization had further damaged the crew. Finally, the impact with the ocean had crushed the remaining fragments. Saltwater, pressure, and weeks on the seabed had further compromised the condition of the remains. Many of the fragments were fragile, broken, and often impossible to identify individually. For the public, NASA released only the most basic confirmation. The agency announced that human remains had been found. Out of respect for the families, no photographs were made public, and no detailed information was shared. This decision has remained unchanged for decades and reflected the agency's effort to maintain dignity and privacy during a tragic time. Internally, forensic teams worked with extreme care. Every fragment was documented, recovered, and analyzed as thoroughly as possible. In some instances, investigators could match remains to specific astronauts using anatomical examination or personal effects. In other cases, the remains were so fragmented that individual identification was impossible. DNA technology in 1986 was still very limited, so investigators relied primarily on traditional forensic methods. All remains were treated with equal respect. Those that could not be matched to an individual were cremated together. On May 20, 1986, these ashes were buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. A simple monument marked the site, listing all 7 crew members by name: Scobie, Smith, Onizuka, Resnick, McNair, Jarvis, and McAuliffe. This burial represented the official conclusion of the recovery of the crew. It gave the families a place to grieve and provided the nation with a tangible point of closure. Yet the remains were only part of the story. The recovered crew cabin held critical evidence about the crew's final moments. Analysis of the cockpit showed that the positions of the crew members suggested that Commander Dick Scobie and pilot Michael Smith had attempted to activate emergency systems after the breakup. While the shuttle had no systems that could have allowed them to survive, the evidence indicated that at least some of the astronauts had been conscious and responding during the seconds after the disaster. The discovery of the remains, combined with the evidence inside the cockpit, forced NASA to confront not only what had happened, but also why it had been allowed to happen. This confrontation would lead directly to a wider institutional reckoning that examined every decision, risk, and failure that had contributed to the tragedy. The investigation that exposed the truth. Once the crew remains had been recovered and the main pieces of the shuttle wreckage were carefully mapped, the focus of the investigation shifted toward determining exactly what had caused the disaster. Engineers and investigators worked meticulously, combining multiple sources of information. They studied the shuttle's flight trajectory, analyzed telemetry data from sensors on board, reviewed launch footage from multiple cameras, and examined the physical evidence recovered from the ocean. Piece by piece, the events of the launch were reconstructed. A clear pattern emerged. The failure had begun with the right solid rocket booster. One of its O-rings had not sealed properly during launch. The freezing temperatures on that unusually cold morning had caused the rubber rings to lose their flexibility and fail. The failed O-ring allowed a jet of flame to escape from the booster. This flame burned through the external fuel tank and caused the structural breakup of the shuttle. What made the tragedy even more devastating was that the O-ring problem had been known before the launch. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had raised concerns that the low temperatures could prevent the seals from performing correctly. They recommended delaying the flight until the weather warmed. However, upper management at the company, under pressure to meet NASA's launch schedule, dismissed the warnings. NASA managers accepted the reassurances and allowed the launch to proceed. The Rogers Commission, appointed by President Ronald Reagan to investigate the disaster, revealed that the problem went beyond technical failure. Their investigation exposed serious communication breakdowns and management failures within NASA. The Commission's report made it clear that the disaster had been both a technical and a cultural failure. The structure of decision-making within the agency allowed critical warnings to be ignored or softened. Risk had become normalized. Safety concerns were compromised in order to maintain the launch schedule. For those inside NASA, the findings were devastating. The recovery of the crew's remains had already confirmed the loss of 7 lives, making the conclusions even more painful. The disaster had been preventable. These 7 astronauts had not died by chance. Their deaths were the result of a chain of human decisions that ignored danger and dismissed expert warnings. In response, NASA undertook a complete overhaul of the shuttle program. The joints on the solid rocket boosters were redesigned to prevent O-ring failure. The management and decision-making hierarchy was restructured to ensure that engineers' concerns could not be ignored without thorough review. Launch criteria were made more rigorous, and safety systems throughout the shuttle were upgraded. The entire shuttle program remained grounded for more than 2 years while these changes were implemented. The reforms were driven not only by the need to correct technical flaws, but also by the memory of the Challenger crew, whose remains had been recovered and brought home. Every improvement had a clear purpose: to make certain that nothing like this disaster could ever happen again. The remains of the Challenger crew now rest at Arlington National Cemetery, but their legacy endures in the countless decisions that continue to protect astronauts today. What do you think about what happened to the Challenger's crew? Comment down below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.